It's sobering, really, when you think about the human cost of war. Just consider this. The First Chechen War, back in the mid-90s, estimates suggest maybe over 20,000 civilians died.
Yeah, possibly even more. It's a staggering number.
A truly staggering loss, and that grim reality is what we're going to try and unpack today.
Right, so this deep dive, it's all about the First Chechen War, which ran roughly from 1994 to 96.
A really brutal period.
Incredibly brutal. We'll be looking at its complex origins, the key events and the consequences, which are still felt today, really. We're drawing on a pretty comprehensive overview of the conflict.
And our goal here is, well, to get to the heart of why this war happened in the first place, and also how it ended up with such a, well, surprising outcome, wouldn't you say?
Definitely surprising in many ways.
Think of this as your shortcut, really. We'll pull out the most important bits, the stuff you need to know to understand this crucial piece of post-Soviet history. Okay, so let's dig in. Where do the roots of this conflict really lie?
Well, this Chechen desire for independence, it didn't just appear out of nowhere in the 90s. Not at all.
Right.
There's a very long history. Resistance against Russian rule, going back to Imperial Russia even. You had figures like Sheikh Mansour, late 18th century.
Trying to unite the North Caucasus.
Exactly. Against Russian expansion.
Yeah.
And that whole struggle continued through the 19th century Caucasian War, which ultimately led to Chechnya being annexed and major deportations happening even back then.
So this context, this history, it's absolutely vital to understanding the mindset later on.
Crucial. It explains the deep-seated drive for self-determination.
Okay, so centuries of tension. How did the Soviet era then shape this?
Well, after the revolution, Chechnya eventually got incorporated into the USSR, became the Checheno-Ingush Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in 1936.
Okay.
But then a really catastrophic event happened in 1944 under Stalin. The NKVD, the state security forces, they ordered the forced deportation of basically the entire Chechen and Ingush population.
The entire population?
Over 500,000 people sent to Siberia, Central Asia, along with other North Caucasian groups too.
And the official reason was collaboration with the Nazis.
Yeah, that was the pretext.
Even though many Chechens and Ingush actually fought for the Soviets?
Correct. Served with distinction, many of them. The evidence for widespread collaboration was flimsy at best, really. It was a massive injustice.
Unbelievable. The consequences must have been profound.
Absolutely devastating. Their republic was just abolished, wiped off the map. It wasn't until 1957, under Khrushchev, that they were finally allowed to return.
And the republic was restored.
It was restored, yes. But that experience, the annexation, the long resistance, and especially this mass deportation, it created this deep collective trauma and a powerful narrative of resilience, of resistance, which absolutely fueled the independence movement decades later.
It wasn't just politics then, it was about identity, about historical justice.
Exactly, reclaiming something lost. So fast forward to 91, the Soviet Union collapses. Russia emerges, but now there's this huge question: how does power work between Moscow and all these different ethnic regions?
Which leads us to the Federation Treaty in 1992.
Yeah.
And Chechnya, they refused to sign.
They did, along with Tatarstan, initially. Out of 88 regions, 86 signed this treaty, trying to sort out federal powers.
But Chechnya and Tatarstan held out. What did they want? More autonomy, independence.
Both were on the table. Greater autonomy or outright independence. Now, Tatarstan eventually cut a deal with Yeltsin, got significant autonomy within Russia.
Okay.
But Chechnya, they remained the sole holdout. No serious negotiations happened, really, from either side to try and bridge that gap.
So this failure to agree on the basics just laid the groundwork for what came next.
Pretty much set the stage, yeah.
And things started escalating with the independence movement led by Dzhokhar Dudayev. Tell us about him.
Right. Dudayev. He led the All-National Congress of the Chechen People, the NCCHP. They became the driving force. In September 91, they took decisive action, stormed the Supreme Soviet building in Grozny.
The existing government building?
Yes. The head of the Grozny party, Vitaly Kutsenko, actually died during that takeover, either killed or fell. Reports differ. But it effectively collapsed the old Soviet-era government there.
And then Dudayev held elections.
He did, in October 91. The Soviet Union said they were illegal, but Dudayev won this massive landslide victory and promptly declared Chechnya's independence.
How did Moscow react initially? Yeltsin sent troops.
He did. Sent some internal troops to Grozny, but they were basically surrounded at the airport and forced to withdraw. Humiliating for Moscow.
A huge symbolic win for Dudayev, surely.
Oh, absolutely. It really boosted the independence movement. Then, formally, in June 92, the Checheno-Ingush Republic split. Ingushetia decided to join the Russian Federation.
Leaving Chechnya on its own path.
Exactly. By 1993, they declared full independence as the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria.
But things weren't stable internally, were they? You mentioned the economy tanking.
Not stable at all. The economy collapsed, black markets thrived, social order broke down quite a bit, lots of violence. And tragically, non-Chechens faced increasing harassment, threats, leading to a huge exodus. Many Russians, Armenians, Jews left.
And even among Chechens, there was division. Opposition to Dudayev.
That's right. It wasn't unified. An undeclared civil war was kind of brewing beneath the surface. Different factions, some supporting Dudayev, others strongly opposing him.
Were there coup attempts?
Several, yes.
Yeah.
Dudayev eventually cracked down, introduced direct presidential rule, dissolved the parliament. It got pretty authoritarian.
But crucially, even this opposition, they weren't pushing to rejoin Russia, were they?
That's a key point, no. Despite the infighting, the goal for basically all significant Chechen political forces at this time was an independent state. Reunification with Russia. That wasn't really on the table for anyone in Chechnya.
Really underscores how strong that desire for independence was across the board.
Absolutely. It was the one unifying factor, even amidst the chaos.
So, with Chechnya determined to be independent, even if internally divided, how did Moscow try to, well, pull them back into the fold? Supporting the opposition seems like a major step.
It was. Covertly at first. Moscow started funneling support money, weapons, even mercenaries to those anti-Dudayev factions.
And imposed a blockade.
Yes, an economic and military blockade, trying to squeeze Chechnya. Then, the opposition with this Russian backing tried attacking Grozny a couple of times in late '94.
But they failed.
They did fail, and crucially, Dudayev's forces captured quite a few Russian soldiers and other Russian citizens who were secretly fighting alongside the opposition.
Ah, so that gave Moscow the pretext they needed for direct intervention.
Exactly. It blew their cover, essentially. Moscow could no longer deny its involvement.
Which led straight to Yeltsin's ultimatum and then the invasion, framed as establishing constitutional order.
That was the official line, yes. Grozny refused the ultimatum to disarm. So December 11th, 1994, Yeltsin orders the army in.
But they didn't call it a war.
No. The Kremlin insisted it wasn't a war. It was a disarmament of illegal gangs, or restoration of unconstitutional order. An internal police action, basically.
Trying to frame it as just dealing with rebels within Russia, not invading a state that had declared independence?
Precisely. That framing was very important for Moscow, both domestically and internationally.
It's quite a chilling perspective, isn't it? Calling a full-scale invasion, basically law enforcement. Must have been people within Russia who disagreed strongly.
Oh, absolutely. Significant dissent. The deputy commander of the Russian ground forces, General Edward Vorobyov, he resigned in protest, called the invasion a crime.
Wow, a top general.
Yes. And Yeltsin's own advisor on nationality affairs resigned. General Boris Gromov, who commanded the Soviets in Afghanistan, also quit as deputy defense minister. He predicted a bloodbath, just like Afghanistan.
He knew what he was talking about.
Certainly did. And it wasn't just top brass. Hundreds, maybe over 800 professional soldiers and officers actually refused orders to participate.
Refused to go.
Yes. And even General Lev Rokhlin, who ended up leading the capture of Grozny later, reportedly refused to accept any medals for his role in the war. A kind of silent protest.
That level of dissent, right up to the top, shows just how controversial this was, even within Russia's own military and government.
Definitely. It wasn't some universally supported decision. Far from it.
So despite that opposition, the invasion went ahead. What were those initial stages like on the ground? Fierce resistance.
Immediately. The Russians expected a quick victory, perhaps, but they met really fierce, unexpected Chechen resistance right from the start.
So the advance wasn't smooth.
Not at all. The northern column got bogged down, took significant losses early on, troops, equipment. There was even an instance where Russian paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines were surrounded and captured by Chechen militia.
Not the walkover they might have anticipated.
Definitely not. They did manage to secure the Kankala airbase near Grozny, which was important. But the main prize, Grozny itself, that turned into the site of just incredibly intense, brutal urban fighting.
And the siege, the storming of Grozny, the destruction was immense, wasn't it? Bombardments, artillery.
Relentless. Just relentless bombardment. Some people who were there, journalists, observers, they compare the destruction to Dresden in World War II.
That level of devastation.
That's what they said. The most intense bombing campaign in Europe since WWII. And thousands of civilians died in those attacks. Just caught in the crossfire or directly targeted.
Thousands. And the initial assault, the New Year's Eve attack, that was a disaster for the Russians.
Catastrophic, a complete failure, huge Russian casualties. The 131st Maikop Motor Rifle Brigade was basically wiped out, annihilated.
It's just destroyed.
Yeah. Eventually, after weeks of horrific street-to-street fighting, the Russians did take control of the ruined city. But the costs, unimaginable, in lives, in resources.
And during this, the Russians accused the Chechens of using civilians as human shields.
They did make those accusations, yes,
Yeah.
which is common in intense urban warfare, unfortunately. But the scale of the Russian bombardment itself caused massive civilian deaths regardless.
After Grozny fell, the Russians pushed further into Chechen territory, didn't they?
They did. The offensive continued into the southern mountains. But the nature of the war started to change.
How so?
As the Russians took more towns and villages, the Chechens increasingly shifted tactics, away from conventional defense toward guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, using the terrain they knew so well.
And this is when we see events like the Budynovsk hospital siege.
Exactly. That was June 1995. Shamil Basayev led a group of fighters who seized a hospital in Budynovsk, a town in Russia proper, taking over 1,500 hostages.
Inside Russia.
Yes, it was a major shock. The siege ended after several days, but over 120 Russian civilians died. It horrified the Russian public.
But it also forced the Russians to pause operations.
It did, forced a temporary halt to the fighting and led to negotiations. Paradoxically, despite the horror, it seemed to almost increase support, or at least visibility, for the Chechen cause internationally. A desperate act, but it got attention.
A grim turning point. And there were reports of child soldiers being used by Chechens, too.
Tragically, yes. There were documented reports of child soldiers fighting on the Chechen side during the conflict.
And efforts towards peace were complicated further. There was a bombing targeting a negotiator.
That's right. General Anatoly Romanov, the Russian commander in Chechnya at the time, was seriously wounded, left in a coma, by a bomb blast in Grozny while he was involved in ceasefire talks. That really undermined trust and made peace efforts much harder.
So even as Russia advanced, the Chechens showed they could still strike back effectively. Those surprise raids, like back into Grozny.
Absolutely remarkable resilience. In March 1996, Chechen fighters launched this large-scale 3-day raid back into Grozny, caught the Russians completely by surprise.
Inflicted heavy casualties.
Significant casualties, yeah. Showed they could still operate right in the heart of the capital, even after the Russians supposedly controlled it.
And there was another major ambush?
Yes. In April 96, near Chatoy in the southern mountains, a large Russian armored column was ambushed and essentially destroyed, wiped out.
Wow. So these Chechen successes, plus the mounting Russian casualties, the unpopularity of the war back home, this all started putting pressure on Yeltsin.
Huge pressure. The war was deeply unpopular in Russia by this point. People were seeing the coffins coming back, hearing the stories, and the 1996 presidential election was looming. Yeltsin desperately needed a way out.
His political survival was kind of tied to ending this war.
Very much so.
And then, in the midst of this, Dzhokhar Dudayev is killed.
Yes, assassinated in April 96, hit by a Russian-guided missile while he was reportedly on a satellite phone.
Did his death change the dynamic immediately? Lead to peace talks?
Not immediately, no. The fighting continued. But the military situation for Russia just kept getting worse. And then came August 96.
What happened in August?
Another stunning Chechen counteroffensive. They launched coordinated surprise attacks back into Grozny, codenamed Operation Zero, or Operation Jihad, led by Aslan Maskhadov, who'd become the Chechen leader after Dudayev, and Shamil Basayev.
And they overwhelmed the Russian garrison.
Pretty much. Despite thousands of Russian troops being stationed there, the Chechens managed to surround key Russian positions, inflict heavy losses, and reportedly executed some Chechens accused of collaborating. Russian attempts to relieve their trapped units were disastrous.
Just couldn't break through.
Faced huge casualties trying. It was a massive military embarrassment for Russia. Again.
And this is when that Russian General Pulikovsky threatened to just flatten Grozny?
Yes, General Konstantin Pulikovsky. He was the commander then. He gave the Chechen fighters 48 hours to leave the city or face massive indiscriminate bombing, including strategic bombers, the kind used for nuclear weapons. Total destruction.
Terrifying for the civilians still trapped there.
Caused absolute panic. But then Alexander Lebed stepped in.
Yeltsin's new security advisor.
Exactly. Lebed had just been appointed after helping Yeltsin win the election. He flew down there, saw the situation was a disaster, and basically overruled Pulikovsky.
He stopped the bombing.
He did. Negotiated a ceasefire on August 22nd. He reportedly called Pulikovsky's ultimatum a bad joke. It was a decisive intervention.
The sign that Moscow had finally had enough.
It signaled a major shift. Lebed recognized further fighting was futile and potentially catastrophic.
And that intervention, Lebed stepping in, that directly led to the Khasavyurt Accord, the peace deal.
Exactly. That agreement, signed on August 31st, 1996, in the Dagestani town of Khasavyurt, was the result of Lebed's negotiations with Moscadov.
What were the main points of that accord? What did they agree on?
Key things were complete demilitarization of Chechnya, the withdrawal of all Russian forces by the end of the year.
All Russian troops out.
Yes. And crucially, they agreed to postpone any final decision on Chechnya's political status, independence, or autonomy until the end of 2001.
So kicking the can down the road on the really tough question.
Essentially, yes. It allowed both sides to stop the fighting without formally giving up their main positions on sovereignty. A ceasefire, a troop withdrawal, but the fundamental issue remained unresolved.
It's just impossible to talk about this war without addressing the human rights abuses, the accusations of war crimes. Both sides faced serious allegations, didn't they?
Absolutely. It was a brutal conflict on all sides. Human rights groups documented extensive evidence against Russian forces.
Such as?
Widespread accusations of indiscriminate bombing and shelling, disproportionate force causing huge civilian casualties. Some observers called it deliberate terror bombing.
Just shelling cities without regard for civilians.
That was the accusation, backed by groups like Human Rights Watch. Reports of soldiers preventing civilians from evacuating conflict zones, blocking humanitarian aid.
And actions by ground troops, Zakiska operations.
Yes, these cleansing operations in villages. Widespread allegations of torture, summary executions, rape, looting.
Yeah.
Especially by MVD troops, the Interior Ministry forces. They were notorious.
Just horrific accounts coming out of those operations.
It's truly horrific.
And the Chechen side, they weren't blameless either.
Regrettably, no. They were also accused of serious abuses. Large-scale hostage-taking, like Budyonnovsk. Killing civilians they accused of collaborating with the Russians. Mistreatment of prisoners of war.
And using human shields. Both sides.
There were reports, yes, documented instances of both Russian and Chechen forces using captives, sometimes civilians, as human shields in combat. It was incredibly ugly.
You mentioned the Samashki massacre earlier. That seems like a particularly awful example.
Samashki, April 1995. It stands out for its brutality. Russian forces entered the village, and estimates suggest maybe up to 300 civilians, mostly unarmed, were killed.
How? What happened?
Accounts describe house-to-house searches turning violent. Deliberate shooting of civilians, burning of houses, reports of bodies being burned. Surgeon Khasavyurt, who worked nearby, gave these graphic accounts.
I remember reading about that. Armed babies. Trucks of bodies.
Yes. His descriptions were harrowing. Young men rounded up and killed. Allegations against mercenaries and even Russian pilots firing on people. He mentioned seeing a Russian APC with Samashki painted on it, alongside a skull. Just pure brutality.
Amidst all that horror, you mentioned Major Ismailov, a Russian officer trying to help.
Yes, Major Vyacheslav Ismailov. It's important to remember individuals like him. He apparently worked tirelessly during and after the war to negotiate the release of captives, Russian soldiers held by Chechens and Chechens held by Russians. He continued trying to trace missing people for years afterwards.
A small glimmer of humanity in a very dark picture. And you also mentioned Akhmat Kadyrov declaring jihad early on. Did that bring in foreign fighters?
Kadyrov, who was initially on the separatist side before switching, did declare jihad against Russia early in the war. That certainly raised concerns and likely did contribute to some foreign Islamist fighters becoming involved. Although the extent during the First War is debated, it became a much bigger factor later.
Right. The impact wasn't just confined to Chechnya, was it? It spilled over into neighboring regions.
Definitely. Ingushetia, right next door, saw a huge influx of refugees. Their president, Ruslan Aushev, repeatedly protested Russian military incursions onto Ingush territory and complained about crimes committed by undisciplined Russian soldiers there.
And Dagestan, too.
Yes, especially after the Kizlyar hostage crisis led to Russian forces destroying the village of Pervomatskoye in Dagestan while trying to free hostages in early '96. That caused a lot of anger and criticism from Dagestani officials towards Moscow.
So tensions rising all around the region. What about reactions within Russia itself? You mentioned opposition to conscription.
Yeah, that became a major issue. Opposition grew, especially in the ethnic minority republics. People didn't want their sons sent to fight and die in Chechnya.
Did regions try to resist?
Some did. Chuvastia, Tatarstan. Their governments passed local laws trying to prevent their conscripts from being deployed to the Chechen war zone. Tatarstan's President Shumyev was particularly outspoken against the war.
Moscow must have been worried about this.
Very worried. The fear was this could snowball, lead to other regions demanding more autonomy or even trying to secede. That was a real concern for the Kremlin, the potential disintegration of the Russian Federation.
And there were international incidents, hijackings?
A couple of symbolic ones, yeah. A Turkish ferry was hijacked, a Cypriot jetliner too, by groups trying to publicize the Chechen cause and the brutality of the war to the outside world.
Let's talk about the numbers, the casualties. You mentioned estimates earlier, but they seem really contested. What do the sources generally suggest?
They vary wildly, which is common in conflicts like this. For Russian military deaths, the official figure Moscow gave was around 6,000 killed or missing.
But independent groups say higher.
Much higher, potentially. Groups like Memorial or the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers, they estimated it could be up to 14,000. Even top Russian commanders, like Anatoly Kulikov, admitted later the military deliberately concealed casualty numbers.
So we don't really know the true Russian military costs. What about Chechen fighter losses?
Even harder to pin down. Basketov initially claimed around 3,000 Chechen fighters were killed. Russian intelligence estimates were much, much higher, but likely unreliable, possibly inflated. We just don't have solid figures.
And the civilians. The numbers there are just shocking. 20,000 up to maybe 100,000.
That's the range you often see. It's huge. Researcher John Dunlop puts it around 40,000 civilian deaths, which seems to align with some Russian stats, but groups like Memorial suggest it could be higher still.
And that claim about ethnic Russians being killed by Russian bombing.
Yes, Sergei Govorukhin, a filmmaker and politician, claimed a large number of the civilians killed in Grozny, maybe 30,000 out of 40,000, were ethnic Russians, killed largely by Russian air and artillery strikes because Chechens had mostly fled to villages earlier. It highlights the indiscriminate nature of the bombardment.
And the physical destruction. Homes destroyed.
Massive damage. Estimates around 40,000 houses and apartments were heavily damaged or completely destroyed across Chechnya, just leveled.
Beyond the deaths, the issue of prisoners and missing people lingered long after the Khasavyurt Accord, didn't it?
Yes, a very painful legacy. The accord called for an all-for-all prisoner exchange.
But it didn't happen cleanly.
Not really. Many remained detained on both sides for a long time. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, they documented hundreds, maybe thousands, of Chechens held by Russia, often on dubious charges, and hundreds of Russian soldiers were still listed as captured or missing, believed held by Chechen groups.
A constant source of anguish for families.
Absolutely. And you had cases like the American freelance journalist Andrew Shumak, who disappeared there in 1995, never found. It just highlights the danger and the lack of accountability. Major Ismailov's continued work trying to trace the missing really underscores how deep those wounds were.
So Khasavyurt ends the fighting, troops withdraw. But it sounds like it was more of a truce than a real peace. What happened next? Were there attempts to build on it?
There were attempts, yes. It was a fragile peace. In November 96, Yeltsin and Moscadov signed an agreement about economic relations, potential reparations for war damage.
Trying to normalize things.
Exactly. Then in February 97, Russia declared an amnesty for fighters on both sides. And in May 97, there was this big symbolic moment. Yeltsin and Maskarov signed a formal peace treaty.
A peace treaty?
Yes, on peace and the principles of Russian-Chechen relations. Maskarov sounded quite optimistic at the time, maybe overly so in hindsight.
Because the peace didn't last.
Not even close. The underlying issue, Chechnya's status, was never resolved, and Chechnya itself descended further into lawlessness and Islamist influence in the interwar years.
Which led directly to
the invasion of neighboring Dagestan in the summer of 1999 by militants led by Basiev and a prominent Arab fighter, Ibn al-Khattab. That invasion, along with apartment bombings in Russia blamed on Chechens, gave Moscow the pretext to launch the Second Chechen War.
So the fragile peace shattered completely.
Utterly. Plunged the region right back into another arguably even more brutal conflict.
Looking outwards, how did this First Chechen War play out on the international stage? How did it affect Russia's image and foreign policy?
It was a real struggle for Russia. They were trying to present themselves as a new democracy, integrating with the West, but the way the war was fought, it raised serious questions.
How did they try to justify it?
Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev, for example, tried to frame it as necessary to prevent the country breaking apart, using language about territorial integrity. But balancing that with international human rights norms, very difficult.
So the West was critical, doubts about Russia's path.
Increasingly so. The sheer brutality reported, the civilian deaths, It definitely fueled doubts in Western capitals about whether Russia was truly committed to democratic reforms and the rule of law.
But wasn't there support for the war inside Russia?
Surprisingly strong support, actually, especially initially. Fueled by nationalism, media portraying Chechens negatively, and genuine fears about the country fragmenting. So you had this disconnect, growing criticism abroad, but considerable backing at home.
And that international condemnation has echoes even today. You mentioned Ukraine.
Yes, in 2022, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Ukrainian parliament officially condemned what it termed the genocide of the Chechen people during both Chechen wars. It shows how these conflicts are viewed internationally and how those interpretations persist and are used in current geopolitics.
So wrapping this deep dive up, what are the absolute key takeaways from the First Chechen War? It's just the scale of the human cost is immense.
Immense human suffering, absolutely. Deep, complex historical roots we talked about. And that really surprising military outcome, a small, determined Chechen force achieving effectively a victory against the massive Russian army.
That's the real aha moment, isn't it? It wasn't just some minor regional conflict. It was a pivotal moment for post-Soviet Russia.
Totally pivotal. Exposed huge weaknesses in the Russian military and state, highlighted those deep ethnic tensions, and fundamentally reshaped the North Caucasus. Its consequences are still playing out.
And it leaves you with that big question, doesn't it? Was Khasavyurt, that peace deal, ever really a chance for genuine peace? Or was it just a pause?
Just a temporary halt before the inevitable next round.
Yeah. You have to wonder about the long-term impact on Chechen identity, crushed hopes, and what kind of future was really possible for the region after all that devastation. Something to definitely think about.